Hi again. Welcome to our webinar today, Supporting English Learners' Oral Language Development Through Academic Conversations. So just a note that this webinar is being recorded. I'm Diane Stair-Fenner, President of Support Ed, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Support Ed is a woman-owned small business in the Washington, D.C. area that's devoted to supporting English learners, their teachers, and their families. We provide professional development, technical assistance, and curriculum support to districts, states, organizations, and also the U.S. Department of Education. Let's get started with our work today. So we're going to get started with a poll. So I'm going to open a poll, and you'll share, how did you hear about our webinar today? Was it through Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Peloton, Colorado, email, maybe a colleague, a website, or another way? So we'll give you a little bit to take your poll. I see that the highest percentage right now, and I'll share the results with you in a little bit, is through email. So maybe through an email from us, from Support Ed, if you're on our email list, or maybe through a colleague or through Twitter. So about 80% of you have voted. So I'd love for all of you to just click a button and tell us how you heard about the webinar today. So I'll go ahead and close out the poll, and I'll share the results with you. So you can see on your screen that most of you heard about this through email, followed by through a colleague or through Twitter. So thanks so much for sharing how you came to us today. So we'll go ahead and talk a little bit, share some housekeeping tips here. So before we get started, really, we'll take a look at our online platform, Zoom, in case you're not familiar with it. So take a moment to find your control bar, which is visible if you've downloaded Zoom. We'll be pausing for questions at the end of the presentation, and you'll use the Q&A button to ask those kinds of questions. You can enter a content-related question whenever you have one. If you happen to experience any kinds of technical difficulties, please use the chat button to let us know. You can also use the chat button to connect with each other and comment on the webinar. Thanks. And we'll send you a PDF of our presentation and also a recording afterwards by email. We'll send this out to you tomorrow by the end of the day. So today our agenda is that I'm giving a welcome. We're going to have my colleagues Jill Kester and Sydney Snyder share research and 4 practices on oral language. Then Emily Francis is going to share some activity ideas and practical strategies. We'll have a Q&A with all of our panelists, and then we'll wrap it up. And again, just a reminder that we are recording this webinar. So we'd also like to share something new with you that will be able to give you a certificate of attendance. We'll share a link to our downloadable certificate for 1 hour of professional development at the end of the webinar. So you have to stick around, and we're really happy to share that to those of you who are here today. So at the end of the presentation, we'll give you a slide that'll have a very easy link for you to type in to download your certificate. And then we'll also share the link at the end of the presentation in our chat, so you can just copy it as well. In addition to our presentation today, we've sent you by email contents of a webinar handout, so some practical tools you can take and use. So at Support Ed, this is something that we really like to do, is to give you practical tools that you can use in your context. We gave you a link to the webinar handout in your email today, and you can also find it on our website at getsupported.net/free-tools. We'll also share a link to the handout several times in the chat today. Or you can also go on our website to bit.ly/O, L, FOR, E, LS to download the handout. So there are many, many ways for you to get to it. And again, if you didn't catch that, we'll send you some links to the handout during the presentation today. One more resource for you is that we've created a Padlet to share resources from our webinar today, and also to give you a chance to add your own resources to support English learners' oral language development. Please note that this link is also case sensitive. We'll also send the link out in today's chat, and it's bit.ly/oral language 4Ls. So let's talk about something a little bit more exciting, and that's today's presenters. And I'd like to share a little bit about each of today's presenters. And we'll start with Jill. Jill Kester is a senior associate at Support Ed with 20+ years experience teaching and leading teachers in English language education. She believes that supporting oral language development in English while building on English learners' oral language skills is an essential piece in their academic language development. Sydney Snyder is a principal associate at Support Ed and a former ESOL teacher. She's a strong advocate for giving ELs the tools and opportunities that they need to share their rich backgrounds and ideas. Astrid Emily Francis is an English as a second language teacher at Concord High School in Concord, North Carolina. She serves students in 9th through 12th grade with various English proficiency levels. Emily's experience as an English language learner inspired her to become an ESL teacher and affords her a deep understanding of the challenges her students must overcome to find success. Emily earned a BA in Spanish and an MAT in ESL from UNC Charlotte. So I wanted to share this slide to show that how we all kind of know each other. And unfortunately, Jill was probably back at our booth right there, so she didn't make our picture. But Sydney and I originally connected with Emily over Twitter, and we finally got to meet her in person at the WIDA convention in October 2018. So we're happy to show this picture of us finally getting to give a hug and say hi in person. So now Jill is going to get started and talk about the importance of oral language practice for ELs.
Hi everybody, I am so glad to get to talk to you about oral language and supporting ELs. And we know that we all agree that this is such an important area. So a lot of what I'm going to tell you, you already are aware of and believe strongly, but also I want you to think about how you can share this research and some of these suggestions with your colleagues, because we're all in it together, and I think to collaborate with all areas of teachers will be really helpful. All right, so let's talk about the value of oral language practice. So it's so important for ELs to hear and practice the discipline-specific language. It's really crucial in supporting their learning of language and content. Another important part of that is providing the repetition of language structure and vocabulary for ELs. And this really helps support their language acquisition, academic language, and also literacy development, as you can see in the next bullet. Additionally, academic discussion with ELs reinforces and enhances content learning and retention of new content, and ELs really benefit from this repetition. In fact, all students do, but especially our English learners. And finally, the oral language practice really helps develop other skills as well, including developing peer relationships, enhancing a collaborative academic environment in the classroom, building confidence and academic identity in our English learners. One part of working with ELs in oral language development is to look at not just giving them the opportunity for academic conversation, but making sure it's very productive. ELs spend less than 2% of their school day in oral interaction, according to some research. And so we would really like to see that increase, but also to see the quality of that time spent increase as well. Walke and Heritage in 2018 wrote about productive talk and how that needs to have depth, it needs to be sustained, and it needs to be student controlled. So by depth, we need to look at how the specific idea being discussed is central to the theme and the objective of the lesson. It needs to be presented in interconnected ways, and it needs to engage students' analytical and higher order thinking skills. Additionally, The productive talk needs to be sustained. So one student's statement needs to be followed by another student's response, right? It can't be just answer after answer without any connection to what the previous student said. And then finally, it needs to be student control. So students need control over what they say. It can't be scripted by the teacher. That said, there do need to be clear parameters set by the teachers for the interactions, from framing the questions to expectations for that academic conversation. All right. So in addition to making sure the talk is productive, it's also very important to build a conversation culture in the classroom and having very clear and explicit norms surrounding the discussions, including respect for diverse ideas. Additionally, we need to model and teach our students how to listen to each other and how to respond. We need to encourage and model the use of academic language, not just vocabulary, but also grammatical structures. And also we need to model and encourage ELs to clarify or ask for clarification when they're not understanding. And another important piece is encouraging participation, and especially for our ELs in really positive ways, by teaching skills for turn taking, by teaching the whole class how to invite others into the conversation, especially those who might be more quiet, and setting up welcoming, strategically designed small groups and giving students roles will make it more welcoming and less intimidating for our second or language learners. And then finally, we need to model and encourage our students to stay on topic and focused on that academic. And let's talk about error correction. So this is something that isn't really discussed as much today, but it is important to touch on, and that is we need to be selective in what we address for errors, right? Because we need to encourage communication and students to share their ideas and not to be so concerned about making mistakes in the language, right? That said, we do also need to provide some feedback for them when errors impact comprehension and impact making sense of the academic content. Avoiding too much error correction, focusing on the language production. We wanted to point out that fossilization, which is when errors, the idea that errors get cemented and then are harder to fix, this is not really an issue as previously thought. So, you know, to keep that in mind, that students, when they're developmentally ready, will be able to become more aware of some of the errors that they're making and automatically fix them. Additionally, recasting is a technique that we often do to correct errors, but it's not necessarily effective. And this is when, as teachers, we might restate what a student just said, but with the correction embedded. And often students won't necessarily pick up on the error correction, but just hear that the teacher is validating their idea and kind of miss out on that feedback. So it's much better to provide focused instruction and explicit correction of those specific language structures. So now it's time for another poll. We want to hear what you think. So what is the most significant challenge that you have in engaging ELs in academic conversations? Is it building a supportive climate, encouraging ELs participation, supporting ELs in using academic language, designing effective oral language activities, or maybe something else? Let's see. So, it's kind of neck and neck, but it looks like designing effective oral language activities is dominating a little bit. But a lot of you are also mentioning encouraging ELs participation and supporting ELs in using academic language. That's great. And designing effective oral language activities is our winner. And that's great because we're about to hear from Sydney and Emily. We're going to share some great ideas with us. So next I would like to turn it over to my colleague Sydney, who will talk to us about 4 practices for supporting ELs engagement in oral language activity.
Great, thank you. So these 4 practices that I'm going to be talking about. these 4 practices that I'm going to be talking about are based on a book that Diane wrote, Unlocking English Learners' Potential. And it's chapter 4. And this book is strategies and tools for teaching and assessing ELs within an equity, advocacy, and a leadership framework. And so chapter 4 is all about oral language development. So the 4 practices that I'm going to be talking about, and I'll go into each of these in the following slides, are coming prepared, using appropriate body language, taking turns, and making connections. These are all things we want our ELs to be doing to really engage with and participate in our oral language conversations. So the first one is coming to the discussion prepared. We know that our ELs really need to feel prepared if they're going to take part in the conversation. And some strategies for doing this include providing student-friendly lesson objectives. So these could be content-related, language-specific, so that students know what they're going to be doing, what the outcome is for the activity. Making sure that we've addressed any prior knowledge that is needed, either by pre-teaching background knowledge or tapping into prior knowledge, providing explicit vocabulary instruction and making sure we provide scaffolds to support that, whether it's a word wall, a glossary, providing students with enough thinking and writing time. So this is really critical. We know that we all are able to benefit when we have a little bit of time to organize our thoughts, and this is especially true for our ELs. And it could be in the form of graphic organizers, so helping ELs organize their ideas in graphic organizers. And then the graphic organizers, maybe the first time with their first partner, they use the graphic organizer, and then they are asked to share their ideas again with a second partner and leave the graphic organizer on the desk. So this idea of helping ELs really build their language skills that way. And a final strategy is scaffolded text-dependent questions. So when they're engaging with a text that you're going to have them discuss, giving them those scaffolded text-dependent questions to help them think about their ideas and organize their ideas. Here's an example of a social studies graphic organizer that you could provide to help students think about different groups over throughout history. And then this could be something that when you're having that discussion, ELs could bring to the discussion and refer to as a support or a scaffold. And here's another example. This would be for cause and effect. Similarly, you could have your students complete it beforehand, they bring it to the discussion, and it provides ELs with ways of organizing their ideas, and which will help them share those ideas more easily. The second practice is using appropriate body language for discussions, and this might be something that we think, oh, we know what effective or appropriate body language looks like when we're discussing, but this is something that's really important to teach explicitly, and that includes appropriate eye contact, facing each other with their entire body, leaning toward your partner, showing understanding through head nodding, using appropriate gestures. And these can be taught through modeling or having students model appropriate and inappropriate behavior. It could be a really fun activity. And it's also important to think about the cultural aspects and be very explicit in identifying that different cultures might have different norms for what appropriate body language is for a discussion. And recognizing that how someone you're talking to might respond if you were using different body language. So for example, if I'm looking down, I'm not nodding my understanding, how is that person going to respond to me, or how are they going to interpret what I'm saying, or my interest in what they're saying? The third strategy is to participate by taking turns. So we all have seen groups where a couple of students do most of the talking, so we really want to look for ways to encourage our ELs to participate. Structured pair work is an excellent way because there's only 2 people there to do the talking, and if you set up the situation where both of them have a role in that activity, then both students will take part. using a talking stick or talking rock can be a really good way for students to recognize now it's this person's turn to talk, and then that now it's this person I should be listening to. As Jill mentioned, teaching language for inviting others to participate. You can model this and also teach it. Miguel, what do you think? Do you agree or disagree? Again, we don't want to put our Ls on the spot or make them feel uncomfortable, but we want to definitely encourage them to be taking part in non-threatening ways. Support for active listening. So really that listening piece, I've heard some teachers describe like a second step for turn and talk. So for example, for the turn and talk, 2 pairs will be turning. After that, they'll turn to a new partner, and instead of saying their same ideas, they'll have to share what their partner told them. So really increasing the role and responsibility of the listener in that situation. And then finally, information gap activities, where each student has different sets of information and they have to share that in order to complete the activity. We'll see on the next couple slides an example of that. So here you can see this is for math, and there's a problem, a math problem that the student has to solve, but the student doesn't have any of the numbers. So the step would be for the student to first write the questions that he or she needed in order to answer the problem, and then ask his or her partner. And in the next slide, we'll see that the partner has the answers, and in this case, the partner has more answers than are needed, so there's some additional information in there, so the partner really has to listen carefully to what's being asked, sort through, and find the information. And this information gap activity, the complete version of it, there is in your Padlet. So there's a question that person A has to solve and a question that person B has to solve by asking questions. The final practice is making connections to what others have said. So we don't want our students just to put their ideas out there, but we want to make sure that they're making connections to others, to making connections to prior learning. And again, we need to model the language that they need. So how do we agree? How do we disagree? How do we clarify if we have a question? How do we add on? So really teaching that language and giving them opportunities to practice through mini lessons. So maybe you have a mini lesson on agreeing and disagreeing, but you do it on a common topic that all students would be familiar with, such as like the best after school activity. So students are able to practice that language without talking about the content. And then the next, you carry it over into the content. Some teachers like to use hand signals to symbolize agreement. So when a student is talking, he or she might see other students showing the hand signal to show that they agree, and that can be really affirming for our Ls. And then turn-taking counters. For example, if students are working in a small group and they have little chips, and then when they talk, they can put in a chip. And you can even have the chips mean different things. So for example, there could be 2 colors. One that means you're expressing a new idea, and the other color means that you're adding on to what someone said, or you're asking a clarifying question, as a way to get students thinking about the different talk moves that they can make in a discussion. Here's some example of sentence stems or formulaic expressions, as Walkie and Heritage refer to them as. So just some language for thinking about these different talk moves that students will make. Some additional considerations for ELs is making sure you have engaging prompts. And this goes back to the idea of productive talk. We want to make sure that what we're asking students to do is really thought-provoking and going to engage them with the topic. Being intentional about your grouping, so deciding whether you want to have students grouped by proficiency level, whether you want to do some language modeling, whether you want to do home language grouping so that students can maybe practice with some home language before moving into English. And also, you can use these groups to build individual accountability by having group roles. Another thought is how you might assess through oral language activities. For example, using a checklist that you go around with as you're listening to see what you're hearing, or having students record their conversations and you could listen to them later to assess both content and language development. And I want to wrap up just by sharing a couple tools, and then we're going to turn it over to Emily. This is an oral language activity checklist. And you can see here, it's just some of the considerations that we've talked about related to the 4 practices, and thinking about, yes, you've done these, or no, you haven't, and what you might want to do to improve your activity design. And this is an oral language activity planning template. So again, thinking about what your topic is, your objectives, and what's the oral language task, and how have you prepared students in relation to the 4 practices for that activity. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Emily, and she's going to talk about her experience of using academic conversations with ELs in her classes.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm super excited for this opportunity and welcome everyone for participating here. Let's go ahead and move on. I'll be sharing some strategies and some activities to help you with newcomers and all English language learners building vocabulary and developing language acquisition. I call all of these activities effective because they highlight what students can do regardless of the language proficiency. So let me go ahead and start with a quote, one of my favorite quotes from Unlocking ELs Potential. By developing lessons that support ELs participation and engagement in academic conversation, you, as the teacher, are providing for ELs equal access to content, supporting high academic expectation for ELs, and providing ELs with opportunities to develop their academic identity. So this quote is core and center to the lessons I prepare every day for my students. Developing their academic identity is core for them to develop their academic success. So first and foremost, I work on creating a supporting language environment where students will feel free to take risk. So allow me to share 3 very quick activities that I do with all my students to affirm identity. And these activities affirm identity and also support language development. So we know for a fact that students learn best when they feel comfortable in the classroom. These activities, the name tense, classroom language, and survival English, are not only activities to support student-teacher relationship, but it also affirms identity, and it helps your students in a sense of developing and feeling belonging in the classroom. It also supports the affective filter, which we need for them to learn. So let's quickly go over with these 3 activities. The name tent is something I give credit to author Carol Salva, author of Boosting Achievement. She shared this activity. Very quickly, when you have a newcomer, you have them create a name tent where they share what language they speak, what country they're from, and how to say their name. And you help them introduce themselves to our class. This validates not just languages, but also identity. It highlights their language, their countries. All of those 3 are important to give them the opportunity to interact. And how does this support academic? Well, they learn how to introduce themselves using complete sentences, and we support them with that. Not just saying the name, but also using a complete sentence. So the other quick activity that we do in my classroom with newcomers, and this is helpful for all ELs, it is a strategy that I learned from No More Low Expectations for ELs from Jenna Chavarria and Julia Nora. They share these questions that students need to be able to say for themselves, and they call it safe self-advocacy because it's something that they need to express for themselves in order to help manage the classroom. So classroom language is also about teaching our students self-advocacy. This activity is front and center for learning. There's just statements that newcomers need to understand and be able to verbalize. They're complete sentences that allow students to feel comfortable and encourages them to participate in class. These are not just set on stone sentences. These are something that can give you an idea of something that they can learn how to say in the classroom. It's important for them not to be able to repeat the sentence, but be able to comprehend what is it that they're saying. At the elementary level, what I would do is use images that go along with each question so students can identify the question with the image. The next one that I want to share is the survival English. And this one is all about understanding and embracing the language acquisition has a process. We go from BICS, which is the basic communication skill, to CALPS. So respecting the process of the language acquisition, I help my students with this list. And we don't go one item at a time. And you will have access to this list. And it is not my list. I give credit to where I got it from. But it's important for students to have these basic communication skills in order for them to be successful in academic language. So such as stating their name and their address, stating about people in their family, knowing words of the weather, or using greetings and polite words. So we don't go through the list one at a time. We have students creating notebooks, and as they have a few minutes in the class, they interact with each other and complete these assignments so they can develop their basic language. All right, so now that I share those three that identify identity and strengthen identity, I like to say that the focus on language, it's a don't. I never focus teaching basic English rules because that is not how language is acquired. For me, what I do is I prepare explicit language instruction that engages ELs in higher order thinking. That is how language is learned. I'm not saying don't teach the rules of the language, but I'm saying that is not how academic language is acquired. So the affirming identity activities explained before, those are activities that they need to be able to support basic skills. Our students cannot afford to be able to focus only on those basic activities. They need to be able to receive rich language. We need to provide students with activity that engages them in meaning and learning. So I'm going to share with you some activities that I do that do engage in content and learning. So if we can move on to the next one, the key to engagement in academic conversation, a critical step in supporting EL's engagement in academic conversation is developing oral language activities that will support their participation. So when I talk about support is, are we modeling? Are we providing sentence stems? And are we collaborating, our students collaborating in order for them to support? If we want newcomers and if we want ELs to engage in academic conversations, then I, as a teacher, need to make sure that I have the support, that I provided the support that they need in order for them to be successful and participate. So one activity that we do as a whole class is activity called whole class conversation. And it's very non-stress activity. Is I post either a cover of a book that we're going to be talking about, or a picture, or something that can ignite a conversation. No hands are raising, just blurting out whatever they can tell me about the cover, or whatever they can tell me about a short video that we show them. And I do have an I see, an I think, and I wonder. They can even blurt out the answer, tell us what they know. If they don't want to say it, some kids feel more comfortable writing the answer, which that's scaffolded to be able to speak it. And I do a Padlet so they can type in the answer so they can share it with their partners. Or I could also have a sticky note where they can share their I see and I think and I wonder. And some students feel more comfortable writing and then speaking it, which is a scaffold that I provide for my students. So this whole class conversation, yes, it could be that the ones that speak more fluently can take over, but those students can be a great role model for the ones that need that language role model participation. So the next one I want to share is the 10-2 chunk and chew. And what I want to say here is that to be able to support student participation in academic conversation, we as teachers need to model what that looks like and what that sounds like. So if our expectation is for students to have higher level academic when speaking to one another, then we have to model that language. They don't have that language yet, and it is our job to model it. So if you look at this picture right here, it's something that we can do as a share reading. And the 10-2 is the 10 minutes where 8 or 10 minutes where the teacher models. They hear me speak, they hear me think out loud, they hear me highlighting, they see me doing and working with the text. And as those words are being said out loud and as those words are coming alive, students are soaking it all in and they're taking in those words to be able to then express it. And that's when it comes to the next activity, which is the chew. Once they have taken it all in, they go ahead and move on to the next slide. I provide my students with scripted talk options. And what I want to share about this is that Carol Salva talks in Boosting Achievement that when students verbalize, students internalize. So when I spend those 8 to 10 minutes sharing and modeling the language, now I need my students to be able to verbalize so they can internalize. But in order for students to be able to verbalize, they need options. And that's when sentence stems come in. And I want to share here with Supporting Struggling Learners in this book by Patricia Vitale Rayleigh. She shares this sentence stems that we can use. But what I want to emphasize with sentence stems is that don't load your students with so many sentence stems that they get lost. It's like a lexicon crazy there. Just provide them with the exact sentences that they are going to need for that specific task that you are giving them. Again, in order for them to be able to provide that verbal task, they need that support. And if we can move on to the next one, I want to show how my students scaffold their own participation in speaking and presenting. So my students have the opportunity to get chart paper or a blank piece of paper, and they draw or they write, speak among themselves, what is it that they learned, and then they share it. I just feel like having them collaborate among themselves. What is it that you learned? Let me see what I learned. And when they put it all together, they empower each other, they help each other, and that gives them the words and the ability to be able to present what is it that they learned. And drawing is a very powerful way to be able to scaffold their presentations. So if you want them to present what they learned, have them draw, and those sketches bring life to their learning. So that is what my last activity that I wanted to present with you. So hopefully you learned something and the wonders that we're doing in our classrooms.
Thank you so much, Emily. This is Diane. I hope everyone can hear me on the presentation today. And so I know that a lot of you have been entering comments in the chat about what Emily and Jill and Sydney have been saying. So, some of you are having trouble hearing me. Is it okay? Okay, it's better now. So now's the time then to have a little bit of a Q&A. So we'll have a few minutes for that. So I know a lot of you have been making comments in the chat and reacting to what our presenters are saying. So I'm going to look at open up the Q&A box and use this feature to ask any questions. Do you have any questions or comments or suggestions about developing English learners' oral language through academic conversation? So I'm going to go ahead and look at our Q&A to see. We have a few questions coming in. Okay. Oh, yeah, and I'll start with, there's a question about recasting. So the question coming in from Dana is, can you please share research about recasting not being as effective as once thought for English learners? This is the first I heard of this and would like to read more information.
Great, I'll go ahead and answer that. This is Jill. This is a great question, and several of you have asked similar questions. So I already uploaded on the Padlet out there as well. So one of the issues with recasting is that it's implicit. And so this kind of correction might not always be obvious. And I know as teachers, we want to do it, very non-confrontational, low effective filter sort of ways. But I think it's so implicit that often students aren't recognizing it as correction, but just as an affirmation of what they just said, right? And so, they're likely to misidentify recast as repetition. Additionally, when we're recasting for students, we are actually getting the language practice in stating it correctly. So not only are we not helping the students gain awareness, but also that they're having trouble, or they're not getting the opportunity to correct themselves. Does that make sense? Oh, maybe I need to say it again. It looks like the audio is not clear.
Yeah, just maybe a recap, Jill, of what you said.
Okay, so essentially, we're getting some feedback.
Let me turn off mine.
I can also.
You all can hear me. Sorry about the tech issue. So essentially, recasts are implicit corrections. So students aren't picking it up, and we're not recognizing recast as correction, but they're instead misidentifying it as a repetition or affirmation of the content that they just communicated. And in addition, there's no opportunity when we recast for students to help them identify their own errors or to correct themselves. It's essentially the teacher getting the language practice, not the student.
Okay, thank you so much, Jill, for that answer. We'll go ahead and look at a couple of more questions, and please do let us know about the audio. We're trying to work with that. Here's a question that I think is for Emily specifically, and that's from Fabiana Calkins, who asks, so how do you teach the rules? I find it helpful when I understand why something is done a certain way. For example, how do long and short vowels sound the way they do in different words? So again, Emily, for how do you teach the rules? So the grammatical rules, for example.
I teach them as we are reading text. So for example, if we are reading about Henry in the Freedom Box, then we come across short vowels. One word has an E that made the short sound, and then another word has an E that made the long sound. Then you make a quick reference, and students keep track of what we're learning. So they have a notebook and they write a quick note, and we don't spend a whole lot of time with that. It should be a quick exposure, yes, intentionally teaching it, but it shouldn't be the center of my entire lesson. It's just something that students come across and then you share it. I just feel like that's the way we learn, at least at the high school level. And at the elementary level, you have teachers that are teaching these grammatical rules already. So at the high school level, I will just incorporate those grammatical lessons into your everyday text.
Great, thank you so much, Emily. Here's another one that I'm going to ask of Sydney. How can we, and this is from Monica, how can we, ESL teachers, coach content teachers most effectively in providing scaffolding for ELs in their classes to encourage their participation?
I think that's a great idea. What I would say is if you can go into the class and model, so as much modeling as you can do with their students, so they can see how it works in their content areas, and then also providing them with some examples of the scaffold. So I think it can be overwhelming for teachers when they have a large class with a lot of different needs for them to think about how to scaffold for their ELs. So the more that you can provide them with examples that then they can replicate, and then providing them with opportunities to see it in action are the best ways to try and get them using those strategies. And I also think it's really important that you don't overwhelm them, like acknowledge that it can be challenging to implement and let them, take time. Well, let's start with one lesson. How can we scaffold that for our ELs, and then continually work to build in more.
Great, thank you so much. Here's another one from Victoria Baldwin. And she asks, how can I persuade, and this is for Sydney or Emily, how can I persuade my secondary content colleagues to devote more time to student academic talk, especially given that so many content teachers feel pressure to get through so much content in so little time? What do you think?
I think that's such a great question. I think that our content teachers, especially at the higher levels, do feel a lot of pressure, and there tends to be a lot more lecture, but I think really emphasizing the fact that it's going to benefit students when they have opportunities to talk about it, and again, showing models of that, and then showing them how, after some kind of academic conversation, how much the ELs can engage and remember that content. And I also think helping them build in activities that don't take a lot of time. So some of these conversations or academic activities that we're talking about, oral language activities, take a longer time, but how can it be just a couple minute conversation where ELs are getting a chance to talk that doesn't take as much time as they might be concerned about? Emily, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Oh, probably not. Okay. Well, we have a lot more to talk about. So this is for either one of you, and it's from Jacqueline, and she says, I have a couple of SIFE students. Are there any activities or recommendations you have for these students? And she says she teaches middle school. So any activities or recommendations specifically for SIFE students?
Hey, I'm sorry. I think my mic was mute and I didn't realize that. I am so sorry. So SIFE students, I work with SIFE students at 90 minutes every day. And again, it's going back to making sure that they have the basic communication skills and at the same time embedding the content. So we don't want to spend a whole lot of time on those basic communication skills that they will learn in the lunchroom or outside with peers. In the classroom with the content, we can embed a lot of the learning that they need for, especially in middle school, that we need to prepare them over to the high school where they're basically on their own. So at the middle school, just make sure you front load them with a lot of vocabulary and a lot of information they might need.
Great, thank you. Another question came in from Caitlin, and she asks, how can I convince my school leaders and classroom teachers that, and this is in quotations, silent and solo doesn't always have to be the only way to work? So how do you convince school leaders and classroom teachers of this? Sydney, do you maybe have an answer for that one?
Again, I think it just goes back to showing them the research about what we know works for English learners, and then the modeling. So could you ask your administrators if you could give a short, professional development to your teachers at a faculty meeting where you walk them through some of the research and then you share maybe 2 strategies that they could try out for bringing in more oral language. I think that that's really the key, is making sure they know why it's important, what the research shows, and then giving them some ideas for how to do it.
Great. Here's another one from an anonymous participant who asks, do you have any tips for getting reticent newcomer high school students to participate? And this person writes, my high school students are very concerned about their peers' opinions of them, which often gets in the way of them being willing to participate in class. Maybe Emily, do you have an answer here about getting reticent newcomer high school?
I think the content that we use needs to be compelling. That I have content that when I bring certain specific content, they have no interest at all in their participation, or their motivation is just so low. But it's a matter of, especially if it's just an ESL teacher that has a time where language needs to be learned in that specific time, then using content that is compelling for the student. And also creating those relationships, because I have students that are very reluctant to doing work, but once you create those relationships, they are encouraged by just a verbal, hey, come on, let's do your work. And it takes time. It is a language shock and there's a culture shock that needs to be worked on before we even consider them to be working on the academic.
Thanks so much. And I think we just have time for maybe one or two more. So one is from Jean, who asks, how can we connect the oral language activities we do with our ELs to assessment? So how do you connect oral language activities to assessment?
I think that a great way is to have students in those discussions and have them record themselves so that you can hear their sharing of content knowledge. And also using checklists. So if we're working on ELs oral language development and their participation in the discussions and thinking about those skills that we want them to practice. Are they able to ask for clarification? Are they able to build on another ideas? Like being really upfront with students that these are the things we're practicing. Maybe you've done mini lessons on them. They know what is being assessed, and then you walk around with your checklist trying to listen for those things. I think those are a couple different ways to build in the assessment piece.
Great, thank you, Sydney. Here's one from Howard, which is a bit thought-provoking. That he says, ELs can get by knowing present, past, and future tenses. Should other parts of speech be taught or modeled, such as subjunctive, which is a tense often used in Spanish? Should compound tenses even be taught? What do you think?
I think that you need to teach what is being used in the writing, the text that students are seeing. So again, we want all of our grammar to be taught within the context of the content that they're using. So if they're seeing more complex tenses in their reading, in their social studies texts, then I think it's definitely essential that we familiarize students with that so that they're able to access that content.
Great, thank you. And I think that will wrap up our live Q&A. But please, continue to use the Padlet. If there are more questions, you can tweet us and we'll give our email addresses at the end as well. And next, just to wrap up our collaboration today, we did want to point out that thank you again for participating. And we know that oral language is such an important topic, and it's one of the topics that at Support Ed we offer in our face-to-face and blended professional development to support ELs and their teachers. Take a look at our website for any more information at getsupported.net. And this summer, we're offering 4 of our popular PD courses, and we're adding a new course on culture. All of our courses are co-facilitated by my colleagues like Sydney and Jill and I, by us, and so we're also authors, and we have an interactive PLC at the core. And so if you take part in these, you'll earn a certificate for 10 hours of PD upon successful completion. And speaking of certificates, so here is the link for you to download a certificate of attendance and add your name to it if you'd like to use this at your school or district. So you would type in bit.ly/OL certificate to download your fillable certificate of attendance for 1 hour of PD. And my colleague Kate is going to share that link with you in the chat as well. So you can just click on it and be able to get your link for today's participation. And just on behalf of Emily, Jill, and Sydney and myself, thank you for participating in today's webinar. We'll send you a recording of the webinar within 24 hours, as long as also with links to our handout and the presentation itself. So thank you so much for being able to join us today. And this concludes our webinar. I'm going to stop recording. So thanks so much.